He was handsome, charming, and a bright, promising young man. But behind that disarming smile, a predator was taking shape. This is the story of how a hidden birth certificate, a resentful mother, and a childhood built on lies created one of the most infamous serial killers in history. To understand the man, you have to go back to the very beginning, to a secret kept in the hushed tones of post-war America. Theodore Robert Cowell was born on November 24, 1946, at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont. His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, was a young, unmarried woman from a deeply religious family. In 1946, being an unwed mother carried a heavy social stigma, a mark of shame that could ruin a family's reputation. The Cowell family, faced with this crisis, made a fateful decision. Louise had considered adoption, but her father, Samuel, insisted the baby be brought into the family, just not as Louise's son. To protect the family name, they built an elaborate and devastating lie. Baby Ted would be raised by his grandparents, Samuel and Eleanor Cowell, as their adopted son. His own mother, Louise, that would play the part of his doting older sister. From his first moments, Ted's identity was a fabrication. The woman who was his mother was called his sister. The people he called mom and dad were actually his grandparents. This lie became the very foundation of his existence. It's a deception so profound, it's hard to fully grasp the psychological damage it could do to a child. Modern psychology tells us that the bond between a child and their mother in the first few years is crucial for developing trust, empathy, and a stable sense of self. When that bond is based on a lie, when the architecture of your identity is an illusion, the results can be catastrophic. For young Ted, the world became a place where nothing was as it seemed. This early experience likely created a deep sense of confusion and mistrust. If the most fundamental relationship in his life, the one with his mother, was a lie, then who could he possibly trust? What was real? Psychologists believe this kind of deception can lead to a fragmented identity. The child learns the world isn't a place of connection, but a hostile environment to be navigated. It can create a survivalist mindset where other people aren't partners, but threats or objects to be manipulated. He learned from his family's example that reality was flexible, that facades were essential for survival, and that the truth was something dangerous to be buried at all costs. This was the first and maybe the most critical wound inflicted on the boy who would become Ted Bundy. If the lie of his parentage was the poison, the environment in his grandparents' Philadelphia home was the spark. On the surface, the Cowells might have seemed like a typical, church-going family, but behind closed doors, the atmosphere was one of fear, instability, and violence. The man of the house, Samuel Cowell, the man Ted called father, was, by many accounts, a tyrant. Reports from neighbors and some family members paint a chilling picture. Samuel Cowell was described as having a volcanic temper, prone to unpredictable, explosive rage. He was a known bigot, spewing racist and intolerant views. His aggression wasn't just verbal. There are numerous accounts of his cruelty. He beat the family dogs and swung cats by their tails. This was the primary male role model in Ted's life during his most formative years. An authority figure who normalized brutality and showed that violence was an acceptable way to get control. Now it has to be said that other family members have fiercely denied these claims. They painted Samuel Cowell as a strict but loving grandfather, and suggested the stories of his violence were exaggerated later to explain Ted's actions. Bundy himself gave conflicting accounts, sometimes defending his grandfather, other times admitting his violent nature. This ambiguity is a classic part of Bundy's story, but the sheer number of allegations about Samuel's behavior is hard to just dismiss. Beyond the physical violence, there was a psychological sickness in the home. Ted's grandmother, the woman he knew as his mother, suffered from severe depression and agoraphobia. She reportedly underwent electroconvulsive therapy, a drastic treatment at the time. The household was a pressure cooker of unspoken tensions, mental illness, and rage. And there was another dark influence. As a young boy, it's believed Bundy found his grandfather's pornography collection. This wasn't just adult magazines. It allegedly included lurid detective pulps filled with graphic depictions of violence, assault, and murder. For a young, impressionable boy already living in a confusing and volatile home, this early exposure to the sexualization of violence could have had a devastating impact. It may have provided the raw material, the explicit scripts, for the dark fantasies that would later take over his mind. When he was just 3, a disturbing incident occurred that's often seen as one of the first red flags. Bundy's teenage aunt, Julia, woke up one morning to find herself surrounded by butcher knives from the kitchen. Young Ted was standing silently by her bed, smiling. When she told her sister, his mother Louise, the incident was brushed aside, but it was a chilling glimpse into the darkness that was already starting to form. In 1950, when Ted was 4, Louise Cowell decided she couldn't take the oppressive environment of her parents' home anymore. Looking for a fresh start, she packed their bags and moved across the country to Tacoma, Washington, to live with relatives. A year later, at a church social, she met a hospital cook named Johnny Culpepper Bundy. They married, and Johnny adopted Ted, giving him the name that would become synonymous with evil, Theodore Robert Bundy. This should have been his chance at a normal life, a stable, 2-parent, middle-class home, but the old wounds were too deep, and new resentments quickly started to grow. The relationship between Ted and his new stepfather was tense right from the beginning. Johnny Bundy was a kind, quiet, working-class man, and Ted, even as a kid, despised him for it. He saw Johnny as simple, unsophisticated, and beneath him. This growing sense of superiority was a clear warning sign of the narcissism that would define him. Ted was materialistic. He demanded expensive clothes and ski gear that were way beyond his family's budget. This wasn't just about wanting nice things. It was about status. He felt he was entitled to a better life than the one his stepfather could give him. He started having elaborate fantasies about being adopted by wealthy and famous people, like the Western stars Roy Rogers and Dale Evans. To him, they represented the excitement and wealth he felt was his birthright, a life stolen from him by his family's humble situation. This envy of the upper class would become a powerful driver for his anger later on. He relentlessly compared himself to others based on money, status, and intelligence, always feeling that his own family was holding him back. Friends and family saw the young Ted deliberately provoke his stepfather, pushing his buttons until Johnny, in frustration, would lash out. It was a twisted dynamic where Ted seemed to engineer his own victimization, maybe as a way to reinforce his feelings of being a superior martyr. He was creating a story in his mind where he was the misunderstood, intelligent son trapped in a world of simpletons. The move to Tacoma and the new name didn't fix anything. It just layered a new identity on top of the old one, adding to the confusion and alienation brewing inside him. He was now Ted Bundy, but the lie of Ted Cowell was still there, a psychological fault line ready to crack. He had a new father he felt nothing but contempt for. Instead of finding stability, he found new reasons to feel resentful, isolated, and profoundly, dangerously different. Every life has turning points, moments that split time into before and after. For Ted Bundy, that moment was discovering the truth about his birth. How exactly it happened is debated. One story, told by his longtime girlfriend Elizabeth Kendall, is that a cousin cruelly taunted him as a preteen, shoving his birth certificate in his face. The certificate listed his father as unknown and exposed Louise as his mother, not his sister. Another version suggests Bundy found the document himself as a teenager while snooping through family papers. Years later, Bundy himself claimed he'd always suspected something was off, that he had just figured it out. But regardless of how he found out, what was a psychological earthquake? In an instant, the foundation of his identity shattered. The woman he knew as his sister was his mother. The people he called his parents were his grandparents. And his biological father was a mystery, just a blank space on a piece of paper. Imagine the shock, the confusion, and then the white-hot rage. The deception wasn't some abstract concept anymore. It was a deep, personal betrayal. He aimed most of this fury at his mother, Louise. The lie she was part of for his entire life was, in his eyes, an unforgivable sin. In interviews later in life, he would talk about this resentment, this feeling that she had robbed him of the fundamental truth of his own existence. This discovery cemented his identity as an outsider. He wasn't just awkward. He was illegitimate, a product of a shameful secret. Psychologists call this a narcissistic injury, a devastating blow to the ego. For a personality already prone to instability and grandiosity, it was catastrophic. The lie became the ultimate justification for his detachment from humanity. If his own mother could betray him so profoundly, then all relationships were suspect. Trust was an illusion. Intimacy was a trap. This event didn't create the monster, but it arguably unleashed it. It gave him the rage and the rationalization he needed to start his descent. The shame and worthlessness he felt twisted into a need for power and control over others. If he couldn't control his own origin story, he would control the destinies of others. He would become the one holding the secrets, the one who decided who lived and died. The discovery of the birth certificate wasn't just a revelation, it was an ignition point. The boy who felt he had no real identity would now spend his life creating a false one, the mask of sanity, while the void inside him grew, demanding to be filled with violence and power. While this storm was raging inside him, the outward signs of Ted Bundy's disturbance started to show up in unsettling ways. His adolescence was marked by a painful social awkwardness. He just didn't fit in. At school, he was teased for a speech impediment that made him withdrawn. He joined the Boy Scouts but failed to keep up, which only deepened his sense of inadequacy. He was the boy on the sidelines, the quiet observer, consumed by feelings of isolation and envy. But this wasn't just typical teenage angst. Beneath the shy surface, a predator was taking root. His behavior started to cross the line from social awkwardness into something truly malicious. These weren't harmless pranks, they were rehearsals for a lifetime of cruelty. A childhood friend later remembered that Bundy liked to scare people. This was an understatement. He started digging what he called tiger traps in the woods, deep pits with sharpened stakes hidden at the bottom, covered with leaves and branches. On at least one occasion, a young girl fell into one, severely injuring her leg. Think about the mindset required for that. The patience, the planning, and the chilling anticipation of someone else's pain. It was a clear demonstration of his growing desire to inflict harm and control unsuspecting victims. This cruelty extended to animals. He was known to buy mice from a pet store, not as pets, but as props for his grim games. He would corral them and, in a twisted display of power, decide which ones would live and which would be killed. In his own small, dark world, he was playing God. His deviance took on a sexual component early on. He became a peeping Tom, getting a thrill from secretly spying on women and girls in his neighborhood. This is a classic precursor to more violent sexual offenses, bridging the gap between fantasy and real-world intrusion. He was no longer just imagining, he was actively stalking. In junior high, his behavior escalated to masturbating in school closets, an act he was caught and humiliated for. These behaviors are a textbook checklist for a developing psychopath. The cruelty to animals, the desire to cause fear, the voyeurism, they all point to a catastrophic lack of empathy and a growing obsession with power, control, and sexualized violence. While his classmates were navigating friendships and first dates, Ted Bundy was nurturing a secret world of dark fantasies, fueled by the violent stories he read and practiced in the woods and shadows of his seemingly quiet suburban neighborhood. He was methodically building the skills of the predator he was becoming. As Ted Bundy moved through his teenage years, a chilling split started to define him. On one hand, his secret life of deviance was escalating. On the other, he was carefully building the public persona that would become his greatest weapon, the mask of sanity. His criminal activities grew bolder. He became a skilled shoplifter, stealing the expensive ski equipment he craved but couldn't afford. He learned to forge ski lift tickets, a small deception that sharpened his skills in lying. These petty crimes eventually led to an attempted car theft, which got him a warning from the police. He was learning to test boundaries, to see what he could get away with, and to perfect the art of the believable lie. But it's during this period that investigators believe Bundy may have crossed the final line from fantasy to murder. The first potential case is the disappearance of 8-year-old Anne Marie Burr on August 31, 1961. Anne vanished from her home in Tacoma, just a few miles from where the 14-year-old Bundy lived. Bundy was a paper boy on a route that passed near her house. There were no signs of a struggle, just an open window and a garden bench moved beneath it. A faint sneaker print at the scene was consistent with a teenager's shoe size. For decades, many investigators have strongly suspected that Anne Marie Burr was Ted Bundy's first victim. Her mother wrote to Bundy on death row, begging him to tell her what happened to her daughter. Bundy denied it, but according to some reports, he later made a cryptic third-person confession about killing a young girl in an orchard, a story that eerily matched the circumstances of Anne's disappearance. While it's never been proven, the case hangs over his youth like a dark shadow, a terrifying possibility that his reign of terror began not in his 20s, but when he was just a boy. This is what makes Bundy's psychology so terrifying. As his inner world of violence was blossoming, he was simultaneously learning how to appear completely normal, even impressive. Despite his social awkwardness, he began to understand the mechanics of charm. He learned to mimic the emotions he saw in others, to say the right things, to present a clean-cut, polite, and intelligent face to the world. He got involved in school activities and later in politics, not because he cared, but because they were stages where he could project an image of respectability. This was the birth of the successful psychopath. Unlike disorganized killers who are obviously disturbed, Bundy was learning to compartmentalize. He could be the budding law student and political aide by day, and the predator stalking the streets by night. The very traits we associate with success, conscientiousness, and organizational skills were being weaponized. The mask he was crafting was nearly flawless. It fooled his friends, his teachers, and later his girlfriends, and even the police. He was becoming a master of deception, hiding a monster not in the shadows, but in plain sight. To really go inside the mind of young Ted Bundy, we have to look at the psychology. What combination of factors could possibly create such a person? The answer isn't simple. It's a terrifying convergence of personality, trauma, and environment, a perfect pathological storm. At his core was psychopathy. When forensic psychologists studied Bundy, he scored an astonishing 39 out of 40 on the Hare psychopathy checklist, a near-perfect score. Psychopathy isn't about being crazy. It's a personality disorder defined by a profound lack of empathy, a manipulative nature, and antisocial behavior. We can see these traits all through his youth. His superficial charm fooled almost everyone. His grandiose sense of self-worth was clear in his contempt for his stepfather and his fantasies of a better life. He was a pathological liar, a trait he learned from his own family and perfected over a lifetime. And most critically, he felt no remorse or guilt for the pain he caused, whether it was a girl injured in one of his traps or the women he would later murder. Bundy is also a textbook example of the dark triad of personality traits: psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism. His psychopathy gave him the aggression and fearlessness. His narcissism gave him the entitlement, the grandiosity, and the constant need for admiration. And his Machiavellianism gave him the cynical, calculating mindset to achieve his goals no matter the human cost. He saw other people not as human beings, but as pawns in his game, objects to be used for his own gratification. This brings us to the timeless debate: nature versus nurture. Was Bundy born a monster, or was he made into one? The case for nurture is powerful. He was born into a web of lies that destroyed his ability to form trusting bonds. He was raised for a time in a household allegedly filled with the violence of his grandfather, which modeled brutality as a form of control. His early exposure to violent pornography may have provided the blueprint for his sadistic fantasies. And the social rejection he experienced could have fueled his rage against a world he felt had wronged him. But the case for nature is just as compelling. Plenty of children have difficult upbringings and don't become serial killers. Bundy showed signs of cruelty and a lack of empathy from a very early age. The animal cruelty, the tiger traps, the incident with the knives. These are not normal childhood behaviors. Many psychologists believe he was a primary psychopath, meaning he was likely born with a brain that was wired differently. This might explain his fearlessness, his slick charm, and his inability to feel for others. As psychology expert Professor Thomas Whittaker noted, Bundy's high level of conscientiousness and organization made him a successful psychopath, someone who could blend in and avoid capture. Ultimately, it wasn't one or the other. It was the terrifying dance between the two. A possible genetic predisposition for psychopathy was ignited and shaped by a childhood of profound deception and trauma. Finally, we can't ignore the role of fantasies. Bundy lived more in his mind than in the real world. His fantasies of violence and control became an obsession. For Bundy, murder wasn't just about killing. It was a ritual. It was about possession. He was trying to make his victims a permanent part of his fantasy life, to own them in a way he couldn't with a living person. This is why he often revisited the bodies of his victims. He was trying to perfect a fantasy that reality could never satisfy, which is why the compulsion to kill became an addiction he had to feed over and over again.
The story of Ted Bundy's youth leaves us with unsettling questions. It's a complex and disturbing puzzle with no easy answers. So, we want to ask you, what do you think was the biggest factor in shaping him? Was it the lie of his childhood and the environment he grew up in? Or do you believe he was simply born with a darkness he could never escape? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you find these psychological deep dives compelling, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation.
The journey from the smiling boy in the family photo to the cold-eyed killer on death row wasn't a sudden snap. It was a slow, deliberate erosion of humanity. It began with a lie that taught him the world wasn't to be trusted. It was nurtured in an atmosphere of violence that normalized cruelty. It was fueled by social rejection that festered into a deep-seated rage, and it was all filtered through a mind that lacked the basic capacity for empathy. These elements combined to create a perfect storm. The trauma gave him the motive, a deep, narcissistic rage against a world he felt had cheated him. The psychopathy gave him the tools, a lack of fear, an absence of remorse, and a talent for manipulative charm. The result was a predator unlike almost any other, one who didn't hide in the shadows but walked confidently in the light, using our own assumptions about what evil looks like as his most effective camouflage.